Good day. Over the last few days, Secretary of State Antony Blinken has been in Kiev talking to senior Ukrainian officials. He's spoken to President Zelensky of Ukraine. He's also spoken to the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister, and he's had meetings with members of the Ukrainian Parliament. He was, by the way, accompanied over the course of this visit by Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland, who seems to have participated in all the meetings. Nuland has a record in Ukraine. She is the wife of Robert Kagan, who is a well-known neocon and somebody who talks trenchantly and writes trenchantly about the United States having a mission to spread democracy in all corners of the world, and this justifying various actions that the United States has taken, which many countries around the world see as objectionable. And of course, Nuland herself presumably shares these views and is known to have played an absolutely pivotal role in the events in Ukraine in February 2014, which the Ukrainians call the Revolution of Dignity, and which the Russians and many people in eastern Ukraine refer to as a coup. She was even caught on telephone discussing with the US ambassador to Kiev at that time the possible future makeup of the Ukrainian government, and identified Arseny Yatsenyuk, a Ukrainian politician, as Ukraine's future prime minister, which he duly became. So Victoria Nuland is someone who has a long record in Ukraine and who Ukrainians know well. But nonetheless, and notwithstanding all of that, it is Blinken who obviously, as Secretary of State, took the lead. Now, in a program I did a few days ago, I said that Blinken would go to Ukraine and give Ukraine a tough message. And essentially that message was that Ukraine should call off any idea it might have of an attack on eastern Ukraine. Doing so would provoke an overwhelming Russian reaction, and the United States is not prepared to come to Ukraine's rescue should that happen. Well, everything that happened over the course of this visit has essentially corroborated that analysis. I say that though one has to go past the language of the various communiques and readouts of the various conversations that Blinken had with people like Zelensky and the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister to get to this. But perhaps the clearest expression of this is in a communique, a statement that Ukraine and the United States published over the course of this visit. And the relevant words read as follows. Firstly, on Ukraine's membership of NATO. The paragraph reads, "The United States strongly supports Ukraine's efforts to achieve its Euro-Atlantic aspirations and build a prosperous, secure and democratic future for all Ukrainians." Now, that does not, in fact, commit the United States to supporting Ukraine's membership of NATO. It talks instead of Euro-Atlantic aspirations, and it couples that with a desire to see Ukraine achieve a prosperous, secure and democratic future. In passing, I would add that the two are clearly coupled, and one of the features of Blinken's visit is that whenever the topic of Ukraine's membership of NATO came up, he immediately went off on a tangent and discussed at extraordinary and fantastic length Ukraine's own domestic affairs, its need to implement various reforms, its need to carry out anti-corruption activities, and the like. The implication is that Ukraine will never achieve its Euro-Atlantic aspirations, which means it will never join either NATO or the European Union, unless and until it successfully carries out these reforms and anti-corruption measures. As practically everybody knows, including, of course, the Ukrainians, that is not a practical reality in any short term. Talking all the time about Ukraine needing to achieve reforms and to sort out its various problems with corruption before it can achieve its Euro-Atlantic aspirations is in effect a way of saying that Ukraine will not achieve its Euro-Atlantic aspirations, will not join NATO or the European Union in any measurable period of time. I would add that if the United States truly and straightforwardly backed Ukrainian membership of NATO, the joint statement, would simply have said as much. The fact that the entire statement avoids mentioning NATO at all and talks instead about Euro-Atlantic aspirations gives the game away. Ukrainian membership of NATO is not on the agenda at any time, in any reasonable time. But then we come to the points about the situation in eastern Ukraine, the conflict there, and the possibilities of Ukrainian military action in eastern Ukraine. And this is what we read. And this is, again, I'm drawing this from the statement. The United States is deeply concerned about Russia's ongoing aggressive actions and rhetoric targeting Ukraine, including the increased Russian troop presence in occupied Crimea and around Ukraine's borders. Before I continue, by the way, I do wonder and ask why the presence of Russian troops on Russian territory, albeit close to Ukraine's borders, should be seen as an aggressive step, but let that pass. Anyway, it then goes on to say, the statement then goes on to say the following. The United States continues to monitor the situation closely and to coordinate with Ukrainian officials, allies, and partners. Note that Ukrainian officials and allies and partners are distinguished from each other. Allies and partners are not Ukrainian officials, and it seems that Ukrainian officials are to be distinguished from allies and partners. Again, I just make that observation. It is there in the statement. And then come the key words. We commend Ukraine for its ongoing restraint and have made clear in our engagement with Moscow that Russia needs to refrain from escalatory actions. Now, the key words there is we commend Ukraine for its ongoing restraint. Everything else, basically, here is fluff. The same goes for comments which appear later in the statement about how Crimea is Ukraine and Donbass is Ukraine and how the United States will support the integration and territorial integrity of Ukraine. What the whole purpose of this visit clearly was to insist on Ukraine's ongoing restraint. In other words, Ukraine must not launch any kind of attack in eastern Ukraine. That is the underlying and overriding message of Blinken's visit. The reason the United States does not want Ukraine to launch an offensive in eastern Ukraine is because it knows that Ukraine would be comprehensively defeated if it did, and the Blinken-Harris administration would then be faced with a massive international crisis which would humiliate the United States and to which it has no coherent answer. I say that because the other fascinating feature of the visit was that in meeting after meeting and in meetings with the media as well, including an interview that Blinken conducted with Ukrainian television, he consistently evaded any suggestion that the United States would support Ukraine in any military fashion in the event that Ukraine found itself at war with Russia. In effect, what he was saying was that Ukraine would have to defend itself. The United States would try to assist Ukraine to build up its armed forces in order to succeed in defending itself against Russia, but the United States will not fight on its behalf. There is some mumbling talk all the time about possible sanctions against the Russians if they do launch an offensive against Ukraine or a counter-offensive against Ukraine. But as we have seen, the Russians are becoming increasingly indifferent to sanctions. They believe they can ride them out, and increasingly it looks as if the United States has recognized that fact and accepts that in the event of a war in Ukraine, Ukraine would not only lose, but that there would be nothing in practical terms that the United States could do to help it. Now, in an article, Glenn Deason, the Dutch scholar, who I find extraordinarily incisive, has actually gone a step beyond that. He has actually said that, in effect, Blinken said to the Ukrainians that the United States would not come to Ukraine's rescue, and he said this in clear-cut terms. Well, he is basically right, though I would say that the message is slightly more coded than Glenn Deason implies, at least from my own reading of the various documents that have come out of Blinken's visit to Ukraine. I think it would be very difficult for a US Secretary of State to admit straightforwardly what is the obvious truth, that the United States cannot help Ukraine if it finds itself in a war with Russia. But nonetheless, Glenn Deason is ultimately right. That is the message. The message that they are giving is that the Americans are giving to Ukraine is that there is no realistic way that the United States is going to help Ukraine if it finds itself in a war with Russia. So there we are. That is the position now. And it looks to me increasingly as if the United States is quietly calling its entire Ukraine venture off. So what can we see going forward? Well, we shall see. We shall see what the Ukrainians do, what the United States does. But I'm going to say this. The United States clearly is now looking to try and scale down its confrontation with Russia in Europe. Obviously, its primary motive for doing that is to focus on China in the Pacific. Whether that is a viable or an effective strategy is another matter. But it does mean that the United States no longer has that commitment to Ukraine, which it sort of implied at various times that it did. Moreover, it was also striking, another thing about this visit was also striking. The Ukrainians at various times brought up Nord Stream 2, and Blinken again consistently and repeatedly skated away from the topic. It seems that despite Ukrainian hopes and expectations, the United States does not intend to do anything to stop Nord Stream 2, a pipeline which the Russian ambassador to Germany has said may be finally completed by September before the Bundestag elections. So, given that this is so, with Sevastopol and the Crimea firmly under Russian control, and with Ukraine losing its position as a transit state, one could argue that one reason the United States is showing less interest in Ukraine is because its utility to the United States as a transit state and as possessor of the most important naval base in the Black Sea has gone or is going. And that perhaps is one reason, one factor for the American pullback from Ukraine. Regardless, it's difficult to believe that the Ukrainians have taken much succor from this visit of Blinken's. On the contrary, they have been given what in effect are their instructions by the Americans. There is to be no war in eastern Ukraine. To repeat again, the words in the joint statement, we commend Ukraine for its ongoing restraint. Note the word ongoing. In other words, the Ukrainians must continue with it. There is no military solution for Ukraine of its conflict in eastern Ukraine. And the only way that conflict will end is if Ukraine begins to negotiate seriously on the basis of the Minsk agreement and finally comes to terms with the people of the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and with Russia. And by the way, that proposal for a summit meeting between Zelensky and Putin appears for the moment to be going nowhere. Thank you for joining me for this program. I look forward to you joining me in future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel that you ran. Please look us up, and you'll find links under this video. Please also check us out on our various new platforms, Odyssey, Locals, and SuperTube. And also please support us to the extent that you feel able via Patreon, Subscribestar, and Patreon. And check out also our Discord server. And of course, don't forget to go to our shop and look at the amazing things you will find there. Our wonderful magic mugs, our t-shirts, our hats, our hoodies, and our sweatshirts. And I hope you enjoyed this video and learned things from it. And I look forward to you joining me in future videos on this channel and on our other channels. And have a wonderful day until then.